They don't look for the smartest people in the room. And that is the first thing you need to understand about Mossad. Intelligence agencies around the world have learned something that contradicts every assumption we make about recruitment. Raw intelligence is not the asset. It is what you do when no one tells you what to do that matters. The test begins before you know you are being tested. You are sitting in a waiting room with no receptionist, no instructions, just a chair, a clock, and silence. Most people assume they are early. They check their phone, they fidget, and they ask questions when someone finally walks by. But they have already failed. Mossad is not measuring how well you follow orders. They are measuring how you exist in ambiguity. How long you can sit in uncertainty without creating your own narrative. And whether you need validation, clarification, or control. The candidates who pass do nothing remarkable. They wait, they observe, and they stay present without needing the situation to make sense. They tolerate not knowing, and that tolerance reveals something much deeper than intellect. It reveals temperament. Most psychological assessments try to predict behavior under stress, but Mossad does the opposite. They want to see who you are when nothing is happening, when there is no crisis to react to, no clear enemy, and no mission brief, just emptiness and time. This is why most candidates never make it past the first stage, not because they lack capability, but because they lack the capacity to do nothing while remaining completely aware. The need to act, to resolve, to impose meaning on silence. It disqualifies more people than any background check ever could. The agents who survive understand a simple truth. Intelligence work is not about knowing what to do. It is about knowing when to wait, and in the waiting room with no one watching. And nothing explain your behavior writes a profile more accurate than any test you will ever take. The second phase doesn't feel like a test because nothing is explained. You are given a task with incomplete information. Maybe a document to deliver across the city or a meeting with no clear objective. The instructions are vague, the timeline is loose, and there is no supervisor to ask and no protocol to follow. And this is intentional. Mossad does not evaluate you based on whether you complete the task. They evaluate how you move through uncertainty. Do you freeze when the variables do not add up? Do you create false confidence to mask confusion? Do you seek permission, invent rules, or simply proceed? Most people fail because they need the situation to make sense before they act. The candidates who advance accept ambiguity as part of the environment. They do not ask clarifying questions because they understand that clarity is not coming, and they make decisions with incomplete data and move forward without emotional attachment to being right. What is being measured is not competence. It is emotional leakage. When you do not know what is expected, your real personality emerges. Some candidates become visibly anxious. Others overcompensate with bravado, and a few become passive, waiting for someone to tell them it is okay to decide. The observers are not looking for brilliance. They are looking for people who operate the same way, whether they are certain or uncertain, whether they are being watched or ignored, and whether the stakes are clear or invisible, because in the field nothing is ever clear. There is another layer most people never consider. The evaluation does not stop when the task ends. How you behave after you have completed the assignment matters just as much. Do you seek validation? Do you explain your choices unprompted? Do you need to know if you did well? That need is a disqualifier, because intelligence work does not provide feedback. There is no performance review, no congratulations, and no closure. You act, and then you wait, and the waiting is where most people unravel. Mossad has learned that the candidates who succeed are not the ones who perform best under pressure. They are the ones who do not register ambiguity as pressure at all. And if you are wondering whether you would pass, the fact that you are wondering is already the answer. They eliminate the impressive ones first, and that is not a metaphor. Mossad has determined through decades of operational failure the charisma, confidence, and natural leadership are liabilities in deep cover work. People who command rooms, instinctively take charge, and need others to see them as competent do not survive long in the field. Because ego has a signature, and that signature gets you killed. During early evaluations, candidates are often placed in group settings where they are systematically ignored. A senior officer may walk past them without acknowledgement. Their questions go unanswered, and their contributions are met with silence or dismissal. This is not cruelty. It is measurement. Mossad is observing how you respond to invisibility. Do you escalate to regain attention, withdraw in frustration, perform harder, speak louder, or subtly seek validation through other channels? Most people cannot help themselves because the need to be seen is reflexive. The candidates who advance remain unchanged. They do not internalize dismissal as rejection. They do not assume it means anything about their value, and they continue operating as if recognition was never part of the equation. This reveals something critical: comfort with irrelevance. In intelligence work, the greatest operational asset is the ability to be forgotten, to exist in a room and leave no impression, to be so psychologically stable that being ignored does not trigger compensatory behavior. Ego does not only appear as arrogance, it appears as the need to be right, to be acknowledged, to matter in the moment. It shows up when someone corrects a minor inaccuracy that did not need correcting, when they over-explain to demonstrate competence, and when they cannot let silence exist without filling it. Mossad has learned that these behaviors do not diminish under stress, they intensify. So they select for the opposite. They choose people who are content to be overlooked, who do not perform their intelligence, and who can sit at the edge of a conversation without feeling anything about not being included. The irony is absolute. The candidates who seem the least remarkable in the room are often the only ones who survive the process. Because the best spies are not the ones you notice, they are the ones you forget were ever there. Stress does not reveal weakness. It reveals identity. And that principle sits at the core of the most psychologically brutal phase of intelligence selection. Mossad and agencies like it do not test candidates under normal conditions, because normal conditions do not exist in the field, so they test you when your mind is failing. Sleep deprivation comes first, not as punishment, but as environment. Candidates are kept awake through rotating schedules, interrupted rest cycles, and tasks that extend past coherence, sometimes for 36 hours, 48 hours, or longer. The goal is not to see if you can stay awake. It is to observe what happens when your psychological defenses collapse. Because exhaustion strips pretense faster than any interrogation. Then the rules change without warning. You are given instructions, you follow them. And halfway through you are told the instructions were wrong, or the priority shifted, or the person who assigned the task no longer has authority. There is no apology and no explanation, only new orders that contradict the old ones. Most candidates break here, not physically but emotionally. Some become visibly frustrated, others shut down, and a few try to impose logic on the chaos, demanding clarity that will never come. What they fail to realize is that the chaos itself is the test. The observers are not watching performance. They are watching emotional leakage. Do you snap when the timeline becomes impossible? Do you argue? Do you comply with visible resentment? Do you become passive-aggressive? Or do you simply proceed as if nothing changed? The candidates who survive do not manage stress. They operate the same way whether conditions are stable or collapsing. There is an even deeper layer, time pressure with no success condition. You are told to complete something urgent, but never told what success looks like. With no benchmarks and no feedback, only urgency without definition. This breaks people who require external validation to function. Because intelligence work does not come with clear wins. You act, the outcome unfolds months later, and you are never told whether what you did mattered. If you need confirmation that you succeeded, you will spend your entire career destabilized. Mossad learned long ago that talent is abundant, but psychological resilience under ambiguity is rare. Stress does not build character. It reveals what was always there. And if exhaustion turns you into someone different, you were never stable enough to begin with. They don't ask if you are lying. They create situations where honesty costs you. And this is how intelligence agencies separate strategic deception from pathological dishonesty. The field does not need people who lie reflexively. It needs people who can lie deliberately, without emotional distortion, and only when necessary. The test often begins with a false accusation. You are told you violated protocol. Maybe you accessed a restricted area or shared information you should not have. And the accusation is specific, enough to sound credible, but is completely false. There is no evidence because nothing actually happened. Most people defend themselves immediately. They explain, justify, and produce alibis because they need the accusation to be resolved, and that need disqualifies them. The observers are not measuring innocence. They are measuring how you react when reality becomes unreliable. Do you panic, escalate emotionally, demand fairness, or assume the system will correct itself if you just explain enough? The candidates who pass respond differently. They absorb the accusation without visible reaction, ask calm questions, and do not defend, collapse, or perform innocence. They treat the situation as information rather than an attack on identity. Then comes the opposite. Test. You are given incomplete or incorrect information and told to act on it. And later when the operation fails, you are blamed. Not for the bad intelligence, but for trusting it. This reveals who takes responsibility strategically versus emotionally. Some candidates shift, blame, others become defensive, and a few accept fault they do not deserve, because they have been conditioned to absorb criticism. And all of these responses are disqualifiers. What agencies want is someone who can acknowledge failure without internalizing shame or deflecting accountability. Someone who can state that the information was wrong without needing vindication. There is a third layer most people never consider. You are observed when you believe no one is watching, between evaluations, during breaks, and in informal settings. What you say, who you talk to, and whether your story remains consistent when there is no pressure to perform it all matter. Because compulsive liars do not lie under interrogation. They lie reflexively in moments that do not matter. Having lost the ability to distinguish between strategic necessity and psychological impulse, Mossad does not fear people who can lie well. They fear people who lie without thinking, because in the field an unnecessary lie is a liability. And the only thing more dangerous than someone who cannot deceive is someone who cannot stop. The most dangerous operatives are the ones no one remembers meeting. And that is not a recruitment preference, but a psychological requirement. Intelligence agencies have learned that ego is the variable that kills more operatives than enemy action, because the need to be seen, valued, and recognized as competent creates behavior patterns that compromise operations. So they test for its absence. Candidates are placed under authority figures who are visibly less competent. People who make obvious mistakes, dismiss valid input, and take credit for work they did not do, creating an environment designed to provoke an ego response. Most people cannot tolerate this, and instead of rebelling outright, they do something subtler. They make their competence visible, correct errors in ways that expose the authority's failure, or communicate frustration through tone, body language, or carefully chosen silence. And all of it disqualifies them. In deep cover operations, you do not get to work with people you respect. You take orders from handlers you may never meet. Follow protocols that seem inefficient and watch mistakes unfold without intervening, because your role is not to fix the system, but to be invisible inside it. The candidates who advance are comfortable being overlooked. When their ideas are ignored, they do not escalate. When credit is taken, they do not correct the record. And when they are talked down to, their behavior does not change. This is not submission. It is discipline. Because submission is emotional while discipline is operational. And compliance happens because the mission structure requires it, not because feelings are involved. Mossad distinguishes between the two by watching what happens after compliance. Whether resentment builds, whether validation is sought elsewhere, or whether authority is subtly undermined. Because resentment follows patterns, and patterns get people killed. There is an even deeper test in which candidates are given tasks that feel pointless, sorting files that do not matter, attending meetings with no clear purpose, and doing work that appears designed to waste their abilities, and those who need their work to feel meaningful do not last. Intelligence work is mostly waiting, sitting in boring cover jobs, maintaining empty relationships, and doing nothing for months while operations develop. And if you need significance to function, you will create it. And creation leads to exposure. The operatives who survive are not the most brilliant ones, but the ones who can be brilliant and choose not to be, who can exist at the edge of irrelevance without feeling anything about it. Because the mission does not need you to matter, it needs you to disappear. Pressure does not test ability, it tests identity. And Mossad understands something most organizations ignore. When the stakes feel high and the variables are uncertain, people do not rise to the occasion, they revert to who they actually are. And that reversion is what gets measured. Candidates are placed in situations where instructions do not align. One authority figure prioritizes speed, another insists on accuracy, and a third criticizes both approaches without offering an alternative, making the task itself simple, but success impossible to define. Most people try to reconcile the contradiction by asking clarifying questions, identifying the real authority, or searching for a logical framework that makes the situation coherent. And that effort disqualifies them. The test is not about finding the right answer. It is about functioning when there is no right answer. The candidates who advance do not resolve the ambiguity. They choose a course of action and proceed without needing validation. Then the time pressure escalates. Urgency is declared without explanation, deadlines shrink, priorities shift, and tasks that once mattered suddenly become irrelevant, all designed to destabilize decision-making. Observers watch emotional regulation under artificial crisis. Do candidates panic when timelines compress, become visibly frustrated when priorities change, rush decisions to appear competent, or maintain the same deliberate pace regardless of pressure? Panic is contagious, and in operational environments, one person's loss of composure can compromise an entire team. So Mossad does not look for people who perform well under pressure, but for people whose behavior remains identical whether pressure exists or not. Another dimension follows. The stakes are highlighted publicly rather than privately, sometimes with condescension or exaggerated concern, and the question becomes whether public failure changes how someone operates. Some grow defensive, others withdraw, and some overcompensate with false confidence, while those who pass absorb criticism without emotional distortion and continue functioning as if nothing happened. This reveals the difference between pressure endurance and pressure blindness. Endurance being the ability to feel stress while controlling the response, and blindness being detachment so extreme that critical information is missed. Mossad wants endurance, controlled awareness, calm confusion. Because real intelligence work is not adrenaline or action, but months of uncertainty, conflicting information, and decisions made without enough data. And if pressure reveals someone you do not recognize, that person was always there. Pressure did not create them. It only made them visible. Pressure does not test ability. It tests identity. And Mossad understands something most organizations ignore. When the stakes feel high and the variables are uncertain, people do not rise to the occasion. They revert to who they actually are. And that reversion is what gets measured. Candidates are placed in situations where instructions do not align. One authority figure prioritizes speed, another insists on accuracy, and a third criticizes both approaches without offering an alternative, making the task itself simple, but success impossible to define. Most people try to reconcile the contradiction by asking clarifying questions, identifying the real authority, or searching for a logical framework that makes the situation coherent. And that effort disqualifies them. The test is not about finding the right answer. It is about functioning when there is no right answer. The candidates who advance do not resolve the ambiguity. They choose a course of action and proceed without needing validation. Then the time pressure escalates. Urgency is declared without explanation, deadlines shrink, priorities shift, and tasks that once mattered suddenly become irrelevant, all designed to destabilize decision-making. Observers watch emotional regulation under artificial crisis. Do candidates panic when timelines compress, become visibly frustrated when priorities change, rush decisions to appear competent, or maintain the same deliberate pace regardless of pressure? Panic is contagious, and in operational environments, one person's loss of composure can compromise an entire team. So Mossad does not look for people who perform well under pressure, but for people whose behavior remains identical whether pressure exists or not. Another dimension follows. The stakes are highlighted publicly rather than privately, sometimes with condescension or exaggerated concern, and the question becomes whether public failure changes how someone operates. Some grow defensive, others withdraw, and some overcompensate with false confidence, while those who pass absorb criticism without emotional distortion and continue functioning as if nothing happened. This reveals the difference between pressure endurance and pressure blindness. Endurance being the ability to feel stress while controlling the response, and blindness being detachment so extreme that critical information is missed. Mossad wants endurance, controlled awareness, calm confusion, because real intelligence work is not adrenaline or action, but months of uncertainty, conflicting information, and decisions made without enough data. And if pressure reveals someone you do not recognize, that person was always there. Pressure did not create them, it only made them visible. Short-term lying is performance, long-term deception is architecture. And Mossad does not recruit people who can lie convincingly for an afternoon, but people who can sustain a fabricated identity for months or years without emotional erosion, memory failure, or identity bleed, which is an entirely different psychological skill set. Candidates are given cover identities and required to maintain them across extended evaluations, not during high-stakes interrogations but in casual conversations, over meals, and during unstructured social time when there is no obvious reason to stay in character. Because that is when most people break, not under pressure but under comfort. The test is designed to expose 3 failure modes, the first being memory discipline, the ability to recall every detail of a fabricated background without hesitation. Not just major points, but small ones like where you went to school, what your childhood pet was named, or why you moved cities. And most candidates fail through inconsistency, forgotten details, or hesitation where answers should be automatic. The second failure mode is emotional leakage, when the real personality begins bleeding through the cover, real opinions, genuine reactions, and instinctive responses that do not belong to the assumed identity. And Mossad watches for moments when the mask slips, when someone laughs at something their cover would not find funny or reacts in ways that contradict who they are pretending to be. The third and most dangerous failure mode is identity bleed in the opposite direction, when the candidate begins to believe the cover, becomes emotionally attached to it, and loses track of where the performance ends and the real self begins, which feels like success but is operationally catastrophic because forgetting who you actually are means you cannot return and instead become the lie itself. What agencies require is compartmentalization, the ability to live inside a false identity while maintaining complete psychological separation from it, to exist as two people simultaneously without either consuming the other. The candidates who pass are not those who enjoy deception, but those who treat it as pure operational necessity without thrill, performance high, or emotional investment in being believed, remaining comfortable with invisibility, uninterested in making the cover impressive, and unconcerned with validation. Because the hardest part of long-term deception is not fooling others. It is maintaining control over yourself while living as someone else, and knowing with absolute clarity when to stop. Failure is not disqualifying. How you internalize it is. And Mossad has learned that the breaking point reveals more than any other phase of evaluation. Not because they want people to break, but because they need to see what remains after the collapse. Candidates are pushed into repeated failure scenarios, tasks designed to be impossible, objective to change after completion, and feedback that contradicts itself, where you are told your work is insufficient, then told you overcorrected, then criticized for hesitation. There is no pattern to learn from and no way to improve. Only continuous failure without explanation. Most people can endure this for days and some for weeks. But eventually their psychological architecture begins to fracture. And that fracture is what gets measured. Some candidates become defensive, explaining why the failure was not their fault by pointing to contradictory instructions, impossible timelines, or lack of resources. And while these explanations are often valid, validity is not what is being evaluated. The real issue is the need to be seen as competent despite the outcome. Others seek approval, asking what they did wrong and looking for guidance, reassurance, or a path back to success. Needing someone in authority to confirm they are still capable. And that need for external validation after failure disqualifies them immediately. A third group shifts blame subtly, framing failure as systemic through poor leadership or communication, which may be accurate but still reveals ego preservation. While another group shuts down emotionally, complying mechanically, but withdrawing psychologically because the stress has exceeded their capacity. None of these responses survive selection. The candidates who pass respond differently. They accept failure without explanation, do not defend, seek reassurance, or rationalize, and instead absorb the outcome as information while continuing to operate at the same functional level as before. This is emotional recovery without resentment, not motivational resilience or bouncing back stronger, but remaining unchanged, because failure does not alter their baseline behavior and their sense of competence is not tied to external validation. What Mossad isolates is psychological stability under long-term erosion, not the ability to endure a single catastrophic event, but the ability to function identically through months of low-grade failure, ambiguity, and silence, because intelligence work is not dramatic collapse, but incremental erosion. Missions that lead nowhere, years of cover work with no visible impact, and decisions that feel wrong, and turn out to be wrong with no confirmation they mattered. If failure destabilizes you, the field will destroy you. But if failure is only data, and changes nothing about how you operate, then you may be one of the few who survives what comes next. There is no final exam, no announcement, no moment when someone tells you that you've passed. That's the last psychological filter Mossad applies. Because the candidates who need closure, who need to know they succeeded, who need recognition for what they endured, they've already disqualified themselves. The evaluation never stops. It continues through every interaction, every conversation, every moment when the candidate believes they're off the record. How you behave when nothing is happening. How you exist when you think no one is watching. Most people perform when they know they're being assessed. They manage their image, control their reactions, present the version of themselves they believe is expected. But over weeks and months, that performance erodes. The real personality emerges in small moments, a comment made in passing, a reaction to someone entering the room, the way you handle boredom, dismissal, or irrelevance when there's no tactical reason to manage it. This is where selection actually happens, not in structured tests, not in high-pressure scenarios, in the spaces between, in silence, and waiting, in the accumulated data of how someone exists when existence requires nothing from them. The psychological profile Mossad builds isn't based on what you do under observation. It's based on who you are when you believe observation has ended. And the traits that matter most are the ones that can't be performed. Emotional invisibility, genuine comfort with ambiguity, the absence of ego not as a discipline, but as a baseline, the ability to live without validation, recognition, or confirmation that what you're doing matters. Some candidates are selected and don't know it for years. They move through life normally. They take other jobs. They build other identities. And then, at some point in the future, when an operational need arises, someone makes contact. Because Mossad doesn't recruit for immediate deployment, they identify psychological architecture. that will remain stable under conditions most people can't survive. And they wait. The test was never about passing. It was about being the kind of person who doesn't need to know whether they passed. Because in intelligence work, you rarely know if what you did mattered. You act. Time passes, and the outcome unfolds in ways you'll never see. If you need confirmation, you'll spend your entire career destabilized. But if you can operate in permanent uncertainty, without recognition, without feedback, without ever knowing if your actions changed anything, then you've already become what they were looking for. The most dangerous psychological test is the one you never know you're taking. And the most valuable operatives are the ones who never needed to pass it in the first place.